Good evening. You're on the Smoking Section, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. And I had hoped to have my good friend Keldon Sergeyev, who is a student at MIT and a person who is very interested in the scientific method and its, I guess you might say, its weaknesses and its strengths. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to be here today. I'm a little bit worried, but I assume he's okay, but he's normally an extremely reliable person. But that is show business, as we say. And so we were kind of going to carry on our discussions about the reliability of science and to some degree how we are in an age when the ultimate authority lies with science. And so people who pose as scientists or claim to be scientists are cloak themselves in the mantle of science, demand actually a great deal of authority. So, for example, we're always hearing 97% of scientists say this, or this is, the evidence is overwhelming, or the science is settled. But there is a lot of evidence that the public actually has too much respect for science and is always kind of giving up its own sense of what is its reason. You know, people are giving up their reason, what they reason to be true, or what their experience tells them, or their own experience or their own observations. Paul Neff is often talking about this. For example, we had a discussion about that today in my apartment where I have lived for 20 years, and I have been smoking in that apartment for 20 years, and many of my guests have been smoking in that apartment for 20 years. Yet the paint job that I had 20 years ago, which I was told by the painter, who was a very professional painter, he said that if I was living alone, I could expect it to last 10 years, but now it's lasted 20 years. And most people who come in that apartment tell me that I don't need a new paint job. I could get one. So there is this perception that if you smoke in an apartment, all of a sudden all the walls are going to turn yellow, and that this is going to cost you more. And this is a perception people have. But is the perception based? Is their perception coming from what they believe? Do they believe what they perceive, or do they perceive what they believe? So if we have a set of beliefs, it very much affects our perception. So people are so inundated with anti-smoking propaganda that, for example, the normal yellowing of walls when they are subject to exposure to light or exposure to the particulate matter that is in all air, let's say coming from oil burning stoves, etc., will turn the paint somewhat yellowish over the years. But they think, oh, it's because someone smoked in here. But my apartment has no residue of smoke on the walls that is discernible. Yet one of the reasons supposedly behind the ban of smoking, the proposed ban of smoking by HUD in all public housing, is that the apartments of smokers, because of their smoke, are more expensive to redo or clean for the next tenants than non-smokers. Now, I did speak to someone who was in the public housing department, I think it was of Lynn, who was not a smoker, but he told me that when any apartment is redone in any public housing development for a new tenant, the walls have to be cleaned, they have to be painted, and so, you know, whether it's a smoker or whether it's a non-smoker, it's going to come out to be about the same price. But, you know, this is something that people perceive and or believe so much that they end up perceiving it. So, for example, I have been to bars where the walls are yellow simply because they haven't been painted for a long time, yet people think, oh, it's because of the smoke, you know, the residue of smoking in the apartment. I even talked to someone who said that, you know, it takes years to get an apartment back from a smoker, but it's, you know, all the apartments in Boston that were built before 1990, they probably, people were smoking in them for 50 or 60 years, and yet they're fine. So the point is that I'm trying to make is if we believe something strongly enough, then we will perceive it. And like, for example, another thing, but sometimes if we believe it strongly enough, even if we perceive something different, we will still continue to believe it. And again, this is something Paul Neff brings up a lot. I mean, if you look around and you see how many people with gray hair in their 60s or 70s or even 80s who are smoking and seem to be in as good health as their peers who are non-smoking, that would probably, if your mind was clear, that would probably bring up some doubts about the lethality of smoking. I mean, smoking is supposedly lethal. Yet, if it were lethal, why would so many people be walking on these streets with gray hair, 70s and 80s, and smoking away? Yet people believe this so much, they've been so inundated, and their minds have become so closed that even their own observations cannot alter their beliefs. Now again, when I began the program was I was talking about people who cloak themselves in the mantle of science and then demand to be listened to and to be heeded. And I bring up often, in 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex. But another part of his speech, this famous speech that he gave in '61, was that he felt that Americans should be very, very concerned that a technological, scientific elite would capture public policy. And, you know, this is something I think has been quite a battle raging here in the United States when we have this science that is settled in all of these matters. And the public is expected to kowtow to these scientists, and the scientists present themselves as to be these seekers after the truth, who, because of their profession, are inoculated against the biases that politicians, corporations, and the public are prey to. And I think this is very, very far from the truth. I think science is as political. I think science is as political, perhaps even more political than politics itself. And I just read a book by a man named Kalanithi, who was a young neurosurgeon and writer who wrote a book, When Breath Becomes Air. It's a recent bestseller, and it details his battle with lung cancer and his eventual, well, it doesn't detail his death because he died before he finished the book, but it's a very, very interesting book. And in it, he mentions that he didn't realize it, but that once he got into the field of science and into neuromedicine, that he realized how, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but close to verbatim, how political, competitive science is, and how strong the temptation is for scientists to take the easy path. And that, by the easy path, that means putting a spin on their research or manipulating things to get funding or attention, or to get ahead in their field. I mean, for example, if you're in an academic department in a scientific field, even in a scientific field, you don't want to come up with research that runs against that of the chairman, because that could very easily jeopardize your advancement. And there is a very famous professor of environmental biology and global change at Stanford University who died in 2010. But, you know, sometimes these people speak with a certain amount of candor that they most often don't, that they avoid. And I'm going to quote him verbatim now. He says, "We are not just scientists, but human beings as well. And like most people, we'd like to see the world a better place, which in this context translate into our working to reduce the risk of potentially disastrous climate change. To do that, we need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. That, of course, entails getting loads of media coverage. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have." That is coming from Stephen H. Schneider, professor of environmental biology and global change at Stanford University, and he made that in 1996, which is, of course, 20 years ago. But again, people have this idea that scientists are incorruptible and they are seekers of the truth who are not at all biased. And that's a very unrealistic view of science. Now, there is nowhere, again, that we've mentioned on this program where this has been more evident than in the disputes over secondhand smoke. You know, whether secondhand smoke is harmful or not. But if you look at the scientific evidence, even the Environmental Protection Agency's 1992 report, and you look at how small the supposed risks are in that, as Michael McFadden, another smokers' rights advocate, points out, if that were a study that was about anything else but secondhand smoke, the results of the EPA's own research would show an increased risk of disease that was so small that under normal circumstances, scientists would interpret it as no risk at all. But because it's tobacco, and because there is a large war on tobacco and a lot of funding in that area, a lot of recognition for scientists who come up with data or come up with research that will support the what would I say, the people who are prosecuting that war. There is this bias that is very, very evident, and so here is again a place where scientists will very often be very much swayed by their biases. And again, like Stephen Schneider says, we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have. And he says we need to do that as scientists because we have to get lots of media attention, and the way we do that, and the reason we do that is to get media attention, is to get broad public support for legislation, for funding, and for things of that nature. Now, in the war on tobacco, even in the early 50s or 60s, there were many scientists of very, very high repute who questioned the use of statistics to condemn smoking, and many of these scientists were then supported because of their views. They were supported by research from the tobacco industry. And then what happened, and this is the first time this happened, is that everyone who was in the anti-smoking camp said, oh, the only reason their research is this way is because they're taking money from the tobacco companies. But in fact, it was the opposite. The tobacco companies were giving them money because their research was such that it disputed most, if not all, of the claims made by the anti-smoking groups. Now, one thing about this whole thing is the media and the news, and I'm not blaming them, but they always want to have a good story. And, you know, the story that tobacco, which had been used in the West for 400 years, and that was very predominant, like in 1965, about 60% of Americans smoked. If you came up with a story that this was deadly and this was killing people, that is something that really excites them. And then if you throw, or excites, you know, news people want to read that type of stuff. So the media piled on. And then, of course, if you have this kind of evil tobacco industry, and people, there's a saying that the public loves to love and the public loves to hate. So if you come up with all of this, you know, we have this evil tobacco industry, these white men in the South who are, and then they've got scientists who are in their pay. It makes a great story. It makes a great read. And so this is what happened, and this is kind of the template that many many reform groups have used. So, for example, any scientist who will testify on the behalf of a corporation, you can ignore his science, you can ignore his pedigree, and you can simply say, oh, he's lying, he's a toady of the industry. Now, this is happening in a lot of ways, and I'm not taking a position on things other than tobacco, but for example, the New York Times has a big article about the NFL and concussions, and it is conflating this with, you know, the denialists of the smoking and lung cancer connection. and being very critical and accusing any physician or any scientist who questions some of the more scary pronouncements that come out about concussions and football, then they are accused of being mercenary and not being good scientists, not being truth seekers, as it were. And oftentimes, this is actually a scurrilous tactic of the reformists. They use this against tobacco, and they use this against any kind of questioning of their thesis. And the New York Times had this very big article on March 24th, which they say, well, for the NFL to deny some of the accusations against them about the seriousness of the concussion problem is similar to the tobacco industry denying the dangers of secondhand smoke. And as I said, the science on secondhand smoke is actually quite clear that it has no health problems associated with it. And people act as if secondhand smoke is really, really dangerous. Now, for example, in my apartment building, there is someone who is concerned because someone is smoking marijuana and he can smell it in the hallways, which I grant can be very annoying if you don't like the smell of marijuana, which I don't either, by the way. But he's afraid that this is going to affect his newborn baby. Now that's totally, why he would think the smell of marijuana is going to be really dangerous as a secondhand smoke smell relative to the smell of cooking fumes that are always in the hallways of our buildings, and the smell of meat that has been grilled, which is often in the hallways. Or, for example, he would have no concern about exposing his infant child to a campfire where you're burning a biomass, which is very, very similar to the burning of, let's say, tobacco, or very similar to the burning of marijuana leaves. And yet he would have no concern about that, or no concern about, let's say, exposure to incense. All of these things, which are essentially the same as marijuana smoke, are tobacco smoke. And it's this kind of fear that people have now that has been kind of inculcated in the population about so many things, and especially when it comes to their children. They think that their children, the slightest wisp of secondhand smoke of any sort is going to, make their children sick. Whereas there is some evidence to the contrary. A lot of people, like one thing that is very, very evident in the last 30 years is the rise of asthma in children and the rise of many other allergies. And even in the medical profession, some people feel that this is not because children are being exposed to too many toxins, but they're being underexposed to things that will strengthen their immune system and strengthen them. And so that, is a contrary view. But again, we're living in an age where people are very, very so terribly worried. Similarly, some of it has to do with, we live in the age of helicopter parenting, and that children have to be protected from any kind of upset, and even college students have to be protected from hearing something that might upset them. And contrary to what a lot of people think, this actually makes people stronger and healthier and more resilient. Likewise, when I was a child, we were exposed to secondhand smoke everywhere, but we have lower asthma rates than children recently. Thanks for watching the Smoking Section. Hope to see you next week. Good night.